Hi, I'm Raedan Sharry here at Dacoma, Oklahoma with Oklahoma State University here at the sorghum field day. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about sorghum nitrogen management, specifically delayed nitrogen management in grain sorghum. You may have heard some of our work out of Brian Arnell's program and others at Oklahoma State talking about delayed nitrogen management in winter wheat, moving that nitrogen further in season, trying to match up when we optimize that uptake where it translocates into the grain instead of putting it in a biomass where we're trying to increase grain yields and proteins in grain in winter wheat. In sorghum, it's a similar story. As we try to match up that nitrogen uptake curve, we move that nitrogen application into the growing season. Typically, if we look at grain sorghum physiological maturity stages, if we think about when that uptake peaks, we are moving towards panicle differentiation about 50 to 60 days after planting. And so what we've seen in a lot of our data, when we're in high yielding scenarios, usually 50 to 120 bushel grain sorghum here in Oklahoma, when we move that nitrogen in season, we're able to translocate more of that nitrogen, use more of it in the uptake of the plant, and have it go to grain yield. Now, if we're talking about lower yield situations or late planted sorghum, where we're talking about maybe yield situations where we're talking about 30, 40, 50 bushels, something like that, we may not see that same benefit to delayed nitrogen, and a lot of times we may be better off, if we're managing for those low yield potential scenarios, putting that nitrogen up front, allowing that plant to really take advantage of that nitrogen early for tillering, instead of just primarily putting all that energy into one main stem head on the sorghum plant. And so what we've seen, if we kind of think about that physiological calendar for that plant, as we move through the season, we really want to have that nitrogen coming into the plant by 63 days after planting, approximately based on our data. Now, of course, that kind of comes with the caveat that we need it reined in and ready for that plant to bring in. And so a lot of our data maybe shows that if we apply it 49 days after planting, or 30 days after planting or something like that, but then we catch that rain later, depending on our nitrogen source, we need to just make sure that nitrogen is into the plant by 63 days after planting approximately to take advantage of that growth, that nitrogen in the panicle differentiation stage and on into the boot and then onto the heading. And so once we start talking about nitrogen application in season, one of the key aspects of the delayed nitrogen management system is that we're trying to increase nitrogen use efficiency. By moving that later in the season, we're taking more in and putting into bushels in the bin instead of being lost as biomass or lost to the environment through leaching or volatilization or these other lost pathways. And so at the end of the day, whenever we're talking about these high yield scenarios where we're applying lots of nitrogen and trying to be as efficient as possible to push grain yields, then we see a lot of benefit as far as being a conservative, being efficient with that nitrogen, which at the end of the day is going to help our bottom line for our growers when we think about pounds of N to pounds per bushel, or bushels of grain per acre. If we go back and look into some of our data, there's a huge difference whenever we have good years where we're set up, and some of the stuff that we can look back to is our irrigated sites over the last few years where we've had these research studies ongoing. Where we have that water, where we get those timely rainfalls, we're really able to take advantage of that delayed nitrogen. And by doing that, we're in those scenarios, we're pushing yield compared to a lot of times, especially where we're at here today in Woods County. A lot of times we're talking about June, July, August. It's hot, it's dry. Maybe we're not going to be able to take advantage of that nitrogen by moving it all the way in season quite as late, especially if we're worried about catching that rainfall to get that nitrogen incorporated. Additionally, when we're talking about delayed nitrogen, one thing that's really important to consider is that if you're at planting and we're trying to apply that nitrogen and maybe there's not a rainfall event in the calendar, in that forecast, we do have flexibility even in those low yield scenarios where we can maximize yield equal to a pre-plant application by moving that all the way up to about 45 days in season, especially even in those low yield environments. Again, it's all about getting that nitrogen into the plant by panicle differentiation so we can take full advantage of it as grain in the plant. One thing to keep in mind is when we're applying this nitrogen, that source is going to come into play. If you're coming in and you're applying this nitrogen in pre-plant and you're applying a dysuria broadcast over the top, you have a very high chance or probability of volatilization of losses from that urea source. The same thing with UAN. Some sources, UAN, part of that nitrogen is going to be readily able to come into the ground. As soon as we get a rainfall, it's not going to be as volatile. Same thing with ammonium nitrate, where we have less likelihood of loss through volatilization. Then we're really just worried about, are we going to leach when we change those sources up? But at the end of the day, all of this comes back to rainfall. We have to get that rainfall event, try to within about 14 days. By the time we get to 5 days after application, specifically with urea, we're already talking about exponential losses over time. And so we really want to limit that. And that's one of the things that delayed nitrogen management gives us, is flexibility to get that nitrogen on at a time whenever the plant's going to be most able to use it, as well as take advantage of any rainfall events that we may be about to capture after that application, which allows us to be much more efficient, much more cost effective with our nitrogen application in our grain sorter crop.